right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I want to welcome you to today's webinar focused on keeping families together, building non-governmental community supports, and protecting families from harmful policies like those found in the Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997, also known as ASFA. This year is the 25th year of ASFA. It is now upon us. And as we look at what is happening to families right now across the US, we know it is not just important, but rather essential to shine a light on this destructive legislation and the injustices that we are inflicting daily on families and children. My name is Stacey Moss, and I am the current president of Public Knowledge. Before coming to Public Knowledge, also known as PK, I was actually a child welfare attorney. In the past, I've represented parents, children, and also our state's child welfare agency at different times during my career. So I have seen firsthand the devastation that these timelines can cause for families. Our PK team is honored to host this first event in a national campaign against ASFA. You'll hear more about the campaign and our future planned events from Shireen White at Children's Rights later today. But first, I wanted to just say how grateful we are to partner with like-minded organizations such as United Family Advocates, the National Association of Counsel for Children, Children's Rights, and the newly formed Family Justice Group in this campaign and movement. Like many of you on the line with us today, I have watched families be ripped apart, and I have seen the trauma that this does to the children, their parents, and their whole extended family. My second job as a young attorney was to file TPRs on behalf of our child welfare agency and clear out our state's TPR backlog. It was a common project at the time, and I was so excited. This was back when ASFA was still relatively new, and I thought, wow, this could mean so much for children and their permanency. But instead, I quickly saw the damage that it can also do. Filing TPRs before a parent has time to get the treatment that they need or get out of jail or prison. Filing TPRs when it's evident that family finding efforts for absent parents or relatives or kin have not been completed. And many more stories from that time and my time working across the country than I have time to share today. But what I do know is that our state intervention in families' lives needs to be temporary and rare. We need to invest in our communities and our villages of relatives and kin to support all families through difficult times. And I genuinely believe that ASFA is not the fix for the system that we all thought it would be 20 or 25 years ago. We have an amazing group of speakers and panelists today to share with you and share more about this movement. To kick us off, we will hear from our keynote speaker, Marty Guggenheim, who will share how the child welfare system in the United States removes children in ways that ultimately destroys families. You will then have the honor and privilege of hearing from Alexandra and David Travis. Their story will underscore how the ruthless timelines in ASFA and the policies of our current family separating child welfare system did not support reunification as easily as it ripped their family apart. Next, we have a panel, and our panelists will offer replacement approaches to what the Travises experienced, and they will highlight how our country's historical racism and biases quickly became the foundation for a system that was never designed to support and strengthen families. This courageous and resilient circle of mothers will confirm that families may look different from one household to the next, but they are still strong families, full of hope, and our current child welfare approaches are broken, and they are not serving the families and children. Hopefully, their stories will move you to support child welfare laws that keep families together and to champion family strengthening policies with vigor, renewed efforts, and an unwavering conviction, as David Kelly, Victor Sims, and Kathleen Creamer will implore us to do as we wrap up our time together today. Again, welcome. We are so glad that you are here with us, and let's get started.
Imagine your children taken because of poverty, not neglect. Where's the compassion in that? Let's lend a hand instead of tearing families apart. Replace reporting hardship with mandatory support. Imagine fighting for your children alone or with a lawyer you just met. Where's the justice in that? Let's ensure parents' voices are heard. Replace silencing of parents with high-quality legal representation. Imagine Black and Indigenous children removed at 2 and 3 times the rate as white children. Where's the humanity in that? Let's make sure families have the resources they need. Replace surveillance with community support. Imagine not knowing where your children are in the foster system. Where's the family in that? Let's prioritize co-parenting alongside supportive resource parents. Replace parental substitution with family support. Family Integrity and Justice Works is striving to replace trauma with resilience, replace power with support, replace fear with care. It's time to invest in families and communities.
Over the past generation, those who run what is called the child welfare system in the United States have turned it into something that should shame us all: a family destruction system. The United States has become the world's leader in destroying families through the rigorous enforcement of the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which is widely interpreted as requiring states to terminate all rights of parents to their children whenever their children remain in foster care for 15 months. No country is as cruel or as ruthless as the United States, which destroys between 60,000 and 80,000 families a year, and more than 2 million families since ASFA was enacted. We not only do this, but we celebrate it in a manner that would be the equivalent of holding each year a celebratory National Execution of Prisoners Month. Only in this field, they call it National Adoption Month, ignoring and hiding the truth that the children being adopted have been stolen from their loving, if politically powerless, families. In too many states across the nation, ASFA is metronomically enforced without any requirement of a showing that the parents have harmed their children or that maintaining the relationship would be harmful to them. The law even goes so far as to pay a bonus for each additional child whose familial relationships with their family of origin were permanently destroyed and who were subsequently adopted by a new set of parents year over year. Everything we know about ASFA's implementation, including the voices of countless children who have been impacted by ASFA, is that this law has wreaked havoc on poor communities, resulting in the needless permanent separation of children from the parents who love them. Each year, tens of thousands of loving parents who would never harm their children and have never harmed their children are deprived of maintaining any kind of relationship with them. This harsh law would not be tolerated if it were to be applied to privileged communities. The law was enacted even though Congress knew that these highly restrictive timelines meant it would be impossible for many parents to retain their parental rights when, for example, the parent was sentenced to a term of imprisonment longer than 15 months. It also did not matter to Congress that it is often impossible to complete a drug rehabilitation program in 15 months, either because of the program's length or because of the dearth of programs in a community. Far too many communities lack services capable of helping parents reach a place where the system would permit them to regain their children's custody within 15 months. This allows local officials to take advantage of the absence of services that it chooses not to offer. At the time of its enactment, ASFA was widely embraced by a bipartisan Congress and even celebrated by many as a prominent civil rights victory. A few newspaper columnists even heralded this as a children's revolution that would be to the abused and neglected children in our foster care system what the Voting Rights Act was to Black Americans in 1965. When he signed the bill into law, President Clinton promised that ASFA would fundamentally improve the well-being of hundreds of thousands of our most vulnerable children. 25 years after this sorry record of the needless destruction of families, it is beyond time to reevaluate the law against its original promise. It has not fundamentally improved the lives of most children who have been removed from their families. Quite the opposite. First, we need to break down what happens to children after their parents' rights are terminated into two categories: those who are adopted after the termination and those who are not. Falling into the second category is an astonishing large number of children, more than 200,000 in this century alone. They are the legal orphans ASFA has produced, children who lose the benefit, both psychological and actual, of knowing they belong to someone and gain literally nothing in return. Only the cruelest of nations would do such a thing. And only an unimaginably cruel nation would refuse to do something about it once the problem has been called to its attention. We are calling it to your attention now, and we demand you do something about it. Repeal ASFA. Go back to the time when we would only destroy a parent-child relationship because we have concluded it would be abhorrent to permit that relationship to continue, such as when parents have engaged in shocking acts of child abuse. That change alone would shrink the pool of terminations to a small percentage of the cases filed each year in this country.
Hi, my name is Christy Matlock, and I work at Family Integrity and Justice Works at PK. I just want to thank Marty for sharing your thoughts with us today on ASFA and for the way that you're supporting children and families. I believe that we are all responsible for how we approach our work in child welfare, how we listen to parents and their children, and how we connect with families who are traumatized by the harmful policies associated with ASFA. Families like Alexandra and David Travis and their beautiful children, due to unfair timelines, a lack of timely representation, Alexandra and her family struggled through painful, traumatic, and horrific experiences in order to reunite as a family. Please listen to a preview of how these harmful policies stole valuable time from her and her family, stole the opportunities and experiences associated with milestones with her children, time and milestones that she will never get back or be able to experience. Thank you.
I believe children, no matter what age they're taken, whether it's at infancy, toddler age, whether it's a teenager, I believe that there's always going to be something missing. There's always going to be the hole in that soul of that child of wanting to know where they come from. it sucked me in, and it became where I started going out at night. I still performed bedtime routines and bath and reading and got him on the school bus and all that. It was like I started drinking at work and continued drinking after work. The division got involved because one day I took my son to Walgreens on a normal trip. We were going shopping. Somebody had smelled alcohol on my breath, even though it was the morning time. I had drank the night before, but being small, I still had a high alcohol content. When the police came, I was always told to be truthful with the police, so I was. I told them, yes, I drank, and it was the night before. They said, well, how did you get here? And I said, well, I drove. I was arrested and jailed on a very, very high bond, even though I had never been in trouble before in my life. Because I had my child with me, I was charged with child endangerment, which was a really hard blow for me because I've always held my children in the highest regard. Once the division got involved, we slowly started losing everything. I never did get bonded out, and I never was heard. I was never given like a lawyer that cared or showed up for me or even cared about me, and I spent 457 days in jail. I think my daughter was 6 months, and my husband used to bring and hold the car seat up in front of which window he knew was mine, so I could see the baby, and my son would wave to me.
It was very difficult. You know, you lose your soulmate. They took her away, so I had to learn how to live without her. And I didn't know how to do anything. She did everything.
The whole time I was in there, the division started the involvement, and the time started ticking from then. And there were services that they put into place for me, but being locked up, you know, I wasn't even able to adhere to anything that they needed or wanted me to do. And I know that I made a mistake by drinking, but that was my fault. That was on me. I just needed help. I didn't do anything to try to harm or cause harm. There was no abuse or neglect there. And that's just where it started. When I was finally released from the county jail, I was restricted from my own home. I was not allowed in my home, but I was given no other options of where to go. They said, oh, go to a friend's house, go sleep on your cousin's couch or whatever. But the thing is that I didn't have friends like that, and I didn't have cousins. My family are my friends. My family is my unit. That is my home with my husband and our children. So I literally became homeless. They told me if I entered my home that I would be violating a safety plan that had been signed, and we had no legal guidance on what we were signing. We were told we had to sign it or else, like they were gonna take the children. And so we signed. These division workers, they didn't give me pamphlets. They didn't tell me where I could go or what I could do. You know, they just left me there in the cold, in the middle of winter, like with no plan of action or no support whatsoever, like I was a monster. It was December when I was released, and I was staying in my car on the side road of my house, and I was so cold, and I just needed a shower, and I was so desperate to see my children that I snuck in, and I hugged my kids. I took a shower, and I spent the night there, and I was sober, and nothing happened to my children. But you know, they got wind of that because apparently they were surveilling the home. That added to another violation of the safety plan. It literally was hours before there was a knock on the door. It was around Christmas time, and I was in the house because we were decorating the Christmas tree. There was a police officer and there was a DCP&P worker. I was scared to death of who was knocking, so I ran upstairs to hide in a toy chest. And my son kept coming up and down the stairs, giving me blow blind, blow little. He was peeking and sneaking to tell me what was going on. He said, don't worry, Mom. Don't worry, Mommy. Everything's going to be okay, Mom. Everything's going to be okay, Mom. And it wasn't okay. First, I heard my husband scream, which was a scream that you only hear in maybe one of the most horrific horror movies. I knew what was happening right then and there. And then I saw them come to grab some of the clothing out of the closets and start packing a bag. And I don't even think my son knew at the time what was going on. And I think he thought he was coming back the next day, that he just had to go somewhere for the night. And to be honest, so did we. We thought they'd come right back. They made a mistake. When the children were removed, it set something off where we started to just lose everything. We had rental assistance, and we were only offered the rental assistance because children resided in the home, because we were a family. Because they were removed, we lost our rental assistance, which caused us to lose our house. And at that time, we were just a loving, hardworking family, just trying to get better and trying to grow slowly, you know, by working hard and, you know, hopefully not having to need the assistance one day. Having that taken away from us made us go from just being a hardworking, low-income family to a completely impoverished, homeless family. They had us going to anger management classes. They had us going to parenting classes. They had us submitting urine drug screens, even my husband, who has no past history of drug or alcohol abuse. We were given about 16 months to run down through these services and just all of a sudden fix everything that was taken, which at that point, everything was gone. The kids, the house, the job, everything. How do you fix that in 16 months with no assistance?
I completed all their tasks. I did it all within the time frame, and then I was told to give up. Give up, you're not going to be anything. You're not going to do anything right. You can't do it by yourself.
And even though my husband did complete all his services and was working on all this for over a year, he still stood no chance in court because they brought up the safety plan violation from the year prior. And I saw myself as the problem, which made me feel even worse because all I wanted to do was get better and get help. And by taking my kids away just made me suicidal. It made me drink more. And there was nobody to hug me or comfort me or anything because I wasn't even allowed around my own family. I did try to commit suicide, and I was very almost successful. I coded 7 times. They brought me back 7 times because I was supposed to not leave.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jay Rajaraman, and I am so thrilled to be here to moderate this panel. I also just want to say thank you to Alexandra and David Travis for sharing their story in that film you just saw. I just want to note that the entire video and her story is available at Public Knowledge, and the link will be placed in the chat for you all. I just want to note that I have had the privilege to work with Alexandra at Legal Services of New Jersey in this work. She has been an incredible soulmate of mine, a teacher. I've learned so much from her to be a better advocate, and I'm just really thrilled that we're able to share her story and now hear from experts in the field. With me today, I have Professor Angelique Day, Judge Karen Baines-Dunning, Professor Vivek Sankaran, and Dr. Jerry Milner. I can go on and on about each of them personally. They're all heroes of mine. They are thought leaders, change agents, spectacular social justice fighters, and we're here today to take on the issue of ASFA and problems and harms caused by ASFA in the child welfare system. So welcome everyone, and thank you for spending some time with us today. So I'm actually going to open it up to the group. And just to hear from each of you, what made you come to do this work in the first place? And why are you doing this work? And I'll start with Angelique.
For me, this work is personal and professional. I'm an alum out of the Michigan child welfare system, so have lived this personally. And I met another foster care alum who is a professor of mine in my MSW program, and talked to me and really encouraged me to help me understand how I could use my story to improve outcome for others. And so he was inspiring to me. And then I had another professor who was a foster parent, specifically under the Indian Child Welfare Act, and she kind of put her arm around me as a student and was really my mentor through my undergrad, through my master's degree, through my PhD, and she continues to mentor me now and is like a grandmother to my children to this day. So, you know, this work honors my lived experience in the system, my support network that I had as a student, and the privilege that I've had to be able to be a not only someone with lived experience, but a child protective service worker who worked in the policy arena at the state level, at the federal level, and now had the privilege of doing research in my current university. So you know, I have the honor to be able to share my voice, and so I appreciate the opportunity, and so I thank you for having me here today.
Thank you. And really, thank you with your experience, especially to be so vulnerable and share with us today. Thank you, Angelique. Jerry?
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. I'd be dishonest if I didn't say that I came into the work by accident, looking for a summer job straight out of college. But I ended up staying because I felt like the career found me rather than me trying to decide what I wanted to be when I grew up, which I'm still working on there. Never have taken it for granted that in my own life, I could have easily been involved in the child welfare system. And just knowing that allowed me to form a connection with people who are experiencing the system, particularly teenagers in the foster care system who were just fighting so hard against everything that had happened to them and against all that was happening to them in the foster care system.
Thanks, Jerry. Karen?
Hi, good to be with you all today. How I came to this work, really the foundation of family. I have an extremely strong, extensive, extended family. And my grandmother helped raise so many people in her community that weren't necessarily related by blood, but whose parents were having a hard time. And that's how they handled that back then. And so when I became a lawyer and started practicing, I did a lot of pro bono work in juvenile court and found I woke up every day thinking about families. And so I transitioned to juvenile court, became a juvenile court judge. But what keeps me in the work is meeting my son's biological mother. He was in foster care. We adopted him. I had a chance to meet his mother, who was very young, and she opened my eyes to a system that I'd never seen before, even though I had been practicing in it for that long. And so I stay in it for her. I stay in it for other families because we still have so much work to do. So I'm happy to be here and really excited about this conversation.
Thanks, Karen. Vivek?
Yeah, so I stumbled into this work in law school, taking a clinic in law school that I now have the honor of teaching, and really got a passion for representing children. And so after graduating from law school, I went to represent children in DC at the Children's Law Center. And I had a kind of a narrow focus at that time, you know, being a guardian ad litem for children in DC's foster care system, until one day I had the opportunity to represent a parent by happenstance in juvenile court. And I think, like Karen just mentioned, even though by that point I had been practicing for 3-4 years in the system and represented many kids, that experience representing a parent gave me a perspective and insight into a system that I had never known. And the alienation and isolation that I felt standing up on behalf of a parent just got me to see the system in a whole new light. And so that sort of set me on a different path for my career. I left the Children's Law Center. Now I'm at the law school, where much of my work is trying to think more holistically about families and not to view children as separate and apart from their families. And for me, it's the families that keep me tied to this work. And I've reflected over the years about what it is about it. And I think that for so many of the families we work with that we're talking about today, they feel like they've been sort of outside of the system, right? Outside of the mainstream, not invited to conversations. And as I think about sort of my role in this country and many of the spaces I've been in. That's sort of how I've felt for most of my life, right? Being, a person of color in very white communities at every place, even now, today. And so I really feel sort of a kinship with this feeling of not belonging that I think then has gotten me just so, just really energized to do this work on behalf of people who feel that way, to figure out how do we bring them into mainstream conversations, how do we give some power back to these families. And that's what really gets me sort of enthusiastic about these conversations and doing this work.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I could add just one thing, what Vivek said, and I don't know if there'll be a better spot, but just as a CPS worker, I guess I should have realized this, but I didn't when I was practicing, how many of the families I was in charge of investigating were also foster care alum. The parents were also alum. And so I think that's an important point of context that people don't think about, is they were the failed children who are now the next generation being investigated.
No, that's incredible. And actually, you're bringing up sort of where I wanted to go, Angelique, and that often when I say that I'm a parent defender, a family defender, most of them were in the system. And that kind of brings up my next sort of question to really delve into this work. We have created a system, right? We talk about it as the child welfare system, the protection system. How are we then gathering today saying it's harmful? How are we saying that's actually destructive and destroying families? And so when we dig deeper, especially into ASFA and other federal laws and other federal creations that we have to exist and survive in now, I kind of would like to ask the group and start with Karen about why is it historically damaging? Why has this happened? Is the system racist, and was that purposeful?
I mean, great question, and we could spend hours talking about this. But really, racism is in the DNA of America. From 1619, when we brought enslaved men and women to these shores and instituted chattel slavery. That's where it all began. And our institutions were birthed from that. And so in the last couple of years, America's gone through a racial reckoning, right? It took decades and centuries and finally a pandemic and the death of George Floyd for us to really figure out that, wow, systems really are not what we thought, right? And it's easy for everybody to then point to the police and law enforcement and date that back to slave patrols, but it's every system, and child welfare doesn't get a pass. The original child welfare system wasn't designed for children of color. And when they were brought into the system, they were treated very differently and very poorly. And then it just continued along the way. And so if you think about the various policies from Jim Crow to convict leasing to the war on drugs and mass incarceration, child welfare reform, all the things that have happened along the way have disproportionately impacted Black and Brown families. And to say that that was just an accident, I think is a little naive. And so in many ways, I do believe that the system is working the way in which it was designed, which is the problem, because we keep trying to tweak the system or keep trying to tweak legislation that at its core has a racist past and a racist core. And so it's always going to disproportionately impact Black families. So, I mean, there's lots of legislation, we could go through those, and but in general, it's just built into every single policy.
So, I mean, thank you. That just kind of grounds us, right? If it's designed to cause harm and destroy families, as we know, let's step back and actually unpack that if we can with this group. And I look to Jerry and Angelique and Vivek. Can you just talk about some of the actual harms, what you've seen in your careers and what you can describe?
I think I'd like to go back to, Karen's description of history, that she gave us this, really vivid account of slavery and that's direct connection to the child welfare system. I'd also like to add, the government sanctioned boarding school movement with American Indian, Alaskan Native children forcibly removed and placed in boarding schools, and children being told their parents were dead, specifically because of the government's intent was to adopt those children to white families. So again, government sanctioned, government blessed policy directly constructed to tear American Indian, Alaska Native families apart, and to destroy the Indian, save the man principle, and saving the man, according to the government, was placing these children in white homes, and that having their culture was looked at as savage and less than and beneath society. So this idea again of promoting white ethnocentric culture at the expense of other cultures. And again, that was government sanctioned past policy. And you could also argue that, at least for American Indian Alaska Native people, was the birth of corporal punishment, in terms of teaching children, that it's okay, and that it's right to beat children and abuse children as part of how you do discipline. And we are all trying to figure out how to unlearn those particular behaviors that were instituted by the government, that you could argue from Karen's perspective in slavery, where government sanctioned, brutal beatings, of slave children through the boarding schools, where you saw that continue. And unfortunately, history isn't over. I mean, we've seen this with our immigrant children most recently during the previous administration, where we saw kids forcibly removed from their parents, put in cages, where they were grossly neglected in terms of their education and their medical needs. And so we haven't learned very much from history.
Yeah.
We have a long ways to go.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jerry.
I would just totally echo what Angelique is saying. I can get real specific about some of the harms that I think the current system is placing on families, and really it is just, I think, a disrespect for the concept of family, and inflicting harm on families who are already vulnerable in so many other parts of their lives. To put them in this situation where separation of their children, oftentimes simply because of their vulnerabilities, seems to be a very unfair, very painful, and a very harmful kind of experience. One of the main criticisms, or one of my main criticisms of ASFA, is unfair timelines for termination of parental rights, particularly when parents are dealing with very complex issues, and the clock is ticking, even when parents can't get access to needed treatment and services. We've got a ridiculous requirement in ASFA around something called concurrent planning. And I've always wondered, I was out in the field when ASFA came in and into effect, and I've always wondered, how can we possibly work toward family reunification and adoption at the same time? Where is our commitment? And how can we expect resource families, children's parents to work in partnership toward separate goals? You've heard Alexandra's story and the harms that caused not only to Alexandra and David, but to their children. The trauma that their children experienced as a result of being separated is one of the most glaring harms that I think our system continues to impose on children and their parents every single day.
Yeah, and Jay, just to build on that, I think for me, just echoing what Jerry said, I think ASFA shows a complete misunderstanding of the importance of relationships. That for the kids that I represent, they love their parents dearly, even those parents who cannot care for them right now. And what we've done is really turned a blind eye to the pain and suffering that so many kids every day experience. Every day across the country, hundreds of children are losing their relationships with parents they love deeply, because with courts just terminating parental rights, agnostic or completely sort of undermining, disregarding those relationships. And that's the default we've created, right? We have a system that has never invested in concrete supports for families, then holds them to these arbitrary timeframes, and then has a default to terminating parental rights if certain things haven't been met. The world that I imagine has a default to relationships, that we start from a basic understanding and a shared agreement that relationships matter, and as a system, we will do whatever we can do to protect those relationships, and then come up with solutions that are family-centered about how to keep kids safe and how to preserve those relationships. But what ASFA does is it in no way shows any respect for what I think is a central part of what I want to do and what I want to create in any child protective system, which is preserve those relationships that matter to kids. And for what I see every day representing kids and parents and handling appeals, I see too many cases where a court is terminating parental rights, even while acknowledging that we are taking away an important relationship for that child.
Right. I think you just nailed the sort of legal fiction that has been created, that even though so many children are removed when they're just born from the hospital, and as Alexandra's story, and you'll see another video after us, where children have never met their family of origin, but and are adopted and living in really healthy adoptive families, but still look for their first chapter, those connections, they still are lost as they grow and build. And this system doesn't provide for that. But to return to you for a second, Vivek, like legally as an attorney who does this work, and then also to Karen, a lot of times when ASFA comes up in these timelines, the pushback to those who say, no, this is ASFA is needed, right? Because children are languishing in foster care. We need these protections. Can you just respond to the need for timelines and the concern of children remaining in foster care for a period of time? And why should we not worry about that? Or what are the alternatives to that?
Yeah, so I think I come at it with a different angle. First of all, any conversation about timelines needs to first recognize that as a system, timelines can only make sense if we invest in families in the first instance. So if you set up a system where we say, you have to address something in 6 months, but we're not going to give you the right tools to do it, like we need to recognize that every day in our system, that is what we're doing. Secondly, I think everyone on this call will agree that giving kids, no one wants children to be in temporary, living arrangements forever. And that's not what we're talking about. First, we're talking about giving families real supports. And second, even when kids can't go back home, for me, we should not have a system that defaults to terminating parental rights and destroying relationships. That we could have a system where you have other arrangements. We have guardianships, we have custody arrangements, we have ones that can potentially preserve relationships. And the data that we've seen by researchers like Mark Testa is that those arrangements can be as stable and long-term as those involving termination. Yet we have this obsession in this country with destroying families, and it's at the core of our child protective system. And so I think you can accomplish things, the system goal of permanency in other forms while still preserving important familial relationships. I think the default to termination is what I think bothers me most about what we're doing right now.
I think the other thing I would add is that the overwhelming majority of children enter foster care because of neglect, not because of abuse. And neglect is a very broad category. And so if children are languishing in foster care, that's the system's fault. And so why we think we should put a timeline on the family and punish the parents and the children because the system has failed to support this family is beyond me. And so the timelines are arbitrary. They were just negotiated in Congress. It started off a little higher, it went a little lower, it settled in the middle. It had nothing to do with brain science, nothing to do with recovery, nothing to do with racism in housing, nothing to do with racism in employment, nothing to do with all the things that impact a family's ability to do all the things the system is asking them to do. And the majority of the time, case plans involve things they're asking families to do that have nothing to do with safety. the safety, the reason the child was removed in the first place. And so I look at some of these case plans and I think I would be overwhelmed by this case plan. You can't ask families to do all these things at the same time. There's no priority. There seems to be no end in sight. And so you really discourage families along the way. Kids get worse in foster care. We've seen it, right? And then the system goes out of its way to keep kids away from their families under the guise of safety. And then they let them just age out of foster care into the world on their own. And where do they go back to? They try to find their families. And so why are we investing all this money to keep kids away from their parents, as opposed to getting them back with their parents and helping them navigate whatever's happening in the family? And so the entire system, I think, needs to be overhauled.
Yeah. I would just say that ASFA becomes somewhat of a doubling down on doing all the wrong things for children and families. It uses most often the most extreme situations out there to justify faster solutions to situations that we regard as a society of being undesirable. I would say the problems with it, particularly as it goes to this idea of preventing languishing in foster care, it's a value set. It's a mindset problem. It's preconceived notions that something like adoption is the best, the fastest, the most desirable way to provide permanency and safety, as Karen has mentioned, for kids in the foster care. And so this idea of preventing languishing, I think that's just a term that rallies people who want to see more children adopted, and consciously or not so consciously want to punish parents for what they perceive them to be, rather than who they actually are. And frankly, I think it's just a cover-up. I think it's a cover-up for not owning up that we haven't worked effectively with families to prevent removals, to strengthen families, and that should be our core mission.
And what you're hitting on, Jerry, also speaks to when a child is taken from their family, that makes it harder for that family to exist. Not even emotionally, socially, psychologically, they start to absorb that maybe they did something wrong. They're called a defendant, they're called an abuser, they lose welfare benefits, they lose access to housing. It becomes impossible to get that child back. If they're depressed, they're more depressed. If they're likely to use, they're struggling with their addiction. And that's created by the system. And I've often heard children I've represented say, I'm not shopping. They're not shopping for their parents. They're not like, I need a nicer house, or I need to have my own room. You know, kids are happy to be in a hotel with their parents. They're happy to be with the parents that they come from, even if they're poor and living in a shelter. You know, that's family to them. And I think you're all hitting on that. I want to actually then take some time that you all have identified the racism in the system. And so even though foster care has decreased in the country and reduced in many places, racism has not. There's still disproportionality and disparate treatment of Black and brown families and Indian children. They're in places where 2 to 3 times more likely to have the system involved with these families, investigate, remove, place with strangers, and more likely to face termination and be adopted by non-kin or family of origin. And so it makes me think about competing legislation, competing protections out there that exist in trying to deal with the racism in the system, like ICWA. And so I just wanted to reach out to Angelique to hear from her about ICWA and what ASFA means in that perspective.
Sorry. Certainly, we know from a practice perspective that ASFA guidelines directly conflict with the statutory guidelines as outlined in ICWA. which oftentimes results in the Indian Child Welfare Act not being followed or undermined, because now you have these two policies that are in direct conflict with one another. And unfortunately, what we've seen in practice is that ASFA seems to always have more power and authority over ICWA, even though, statutorily it shouldn't be that way. And so, there's lots of really great lessons that can be learned from ICWA that I could argue could be applied to all children in terms of helping not only our BIPOC children, but all children in the child welfare system. Certainly, we've talked about, in terms of ASFA, these mandatory timelines that are put on forth. ICWA understands and doesn't actually reference timelines. And there was lots of testimony when ASFA was being put in place, that it was undermining the ICWA. American Indian, Alaska Native leaders saw this right away when this particular legislation was coming through. And was, really set up to harm or compromise the ICWA. And you could argue that maybe that was intentional. Maybe that was a systemic thing, a purposeful decision that was made. If you look at lessons learned from ICWA, to this day, tribes that have exclusive jurisdiction over their cases, they never use termination of parental rights, and have always raised this, if the children can't be safe in the home, there's this transfer of legal custody to relatives by and far. And that's a practice that we know from brain science is less traumatizing alternative for kids. It allows them to maintain the relationships that Vivek spoke to. And so there's a lot of lessons learned from the Indian Child Welfare Act that could be applied to all children in the child welfare system. One of the other pieces being active efforts, right? We talk about family preservation as being, paramount to ensure that kids and families are served best. And ICWA was the first federal law ever to be signed that emphasized family preservation over removal and termination of parental rights. The first law to talk about the strength of relative placements. Many folks who implement the ICWA in tribes talk about customary adoption, which involves zero termination of parental rights. It's a tribally derived, system reform effort that, allows kids to maintain those critical family relationships. And is, I think it's a standard that we could all learn from and apply everywhere. Active efforts could benefit all children. This idea of customary adoption, and not terminating parental rights are things that could benefit all children. And I know we're in a precarious time because we do have a very critical Supreme Court decision coming up in early November about Indian Child Welfare Act. And if we can use this as an opportunity to plead with all those who are seeing this, to really use your voice, to help educate as many people as you can about, ICWA and how, this really is a gold standard in child welfare practice, and how could, all children in child welfare benefit from the strengths of that policy. And we are in a time right now where we're not only talking about things that are broken in the system, like ASFA being one of those pieces, but this idea of now we're in a point in time where we're breaking what isn't fixed. Are breaking something that was good in terms of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So we really are at a precarious time in our history in terms of, are we really behind supporting our children and families? Because right now the conversation is moving to the contrary of what we say we want.
Thank you. I mean, so beautifully said, and it makes me think about what I'm often asked as an advocate. Like you said, is it really that broken? Like, what's the call to action from this group? And I just would love to hear, why can we not train ourselves out of this? As we're in the system, you're in court. How do you advocate? What, is it judge limited, Karen, from from ASFA, aren't there incredible informational memorandums that Jerry and David created at Children's Ver, right? I mean, is there enough? Haven't we done enough? Why does something need to be changed with ASFA? I'll start with you, Karen.
I don't think you can train your way out of this. In the summer of 2020, that summer, I was asked to review a lot of police department use of force policies. We reviewed policies. We wrote beautiful policies. It's all on paper. It doesn't change because the culture of the institution hasn't changed. We haven't rooted out the racism in the actual structure itself. And so no amount of training or tweaking of ASFA is going to do it. And so it has to be repealed, and stronger, very assertive legislation and policy needs to come forth. And so similar to what Angelique was just saying, honoring families and the culture of families, recognizing that the trauma of removal is a lifetime trauma. And so as much as people talk about the child's best interest and ticking time clocks, 15 months, when you think about it over the span of a lifetime, is not a lot of time. And so you're making a very quick knee-jerk decision that's not only separating a child from their parent, but their entire family structure for their lifetime. That's really serious. I'm with Vivek. I think we should do away with TPR. I think many people have described it through the years as the civil death penalty. That's why we don't kill people in death penalty right away. There are years of appeals and all kinds of stuff. And that's a whole nother chapter in another conference, I'm sure. But I do think it needs to be repealed completely. And in its place, we need to put something that's very pro-family to completely flip and change the curriculum within social work schools, change the mindsets of volunteers, change the financial incentives that are attached to the system. Because right now, the systems are incentivized to terminate and to adopt, not to reunite and preserve families. And so we've got to think about the entire process.
I love it. I love where we're going. We have a few more minutes, but I want to hear from Vivek. I mean, we got rid of termination, concurrent planning, ASFA, what else?
Well, the data tells a story that why this isn't a training issue. Well, since ASFA has been passed, we've seen an explosion of how often we destroy families. And we've had many people do trainings over the years. It's not going to solve the problem. I think that the Adoption Safe Families Act in many ways delegitimizes the entire system. We haven't yet mentioned that there have been, I think, 200,000 kids who've aged out of foster care with their rights of their parents terminated since ASFA. If you look at states and their just wide variance and how often and how frequently and how quickly they terminate parental rights, it's a system where you live dictates your likelihood of having your rights terminated. None of us should feel comfortable with that. As we have not mentioned here that we're dealing with the fundamental right to parent, right, protected by the 14th Amendment. It's a sacred constitutional right. And as we think about how to frame it, we need to think about, what our jurisprudence is. When we think about taking away fundamental rights, a core concept is courts have to look for the least restrictive means, which is how do we protect this right whilst, accomplishing other goals? Is there and that should be the framework. And if you think about the framework, that the framework should be, we don't want to be taking away these rights from people. What ASFA does is ignores that constitutional framework and sprints to termination and incentivizes terminating without even requiring courts to engage in, are there any other solutions like the ones that Angelique mentioned, like a guardianship, like a custody arrangement? We don't do that. And so one of the invitations to advocates across the country is that we need to start framing termination of parental rights decisions in a constitutional context, using the language of strict scrutiny, compelling state interest, least restrictive means, and challenging these. If there are other options available and the data shows that they can be as permanent and as stable and can keep kids safe, then we need to be educating courts as lawyers that that trial courts have to be considering and prioritizing those other options, because this is a fundamental right at stake. So in addition to all the awesome things that you just said, Jay, we're going to add like an invitation to lawyers to challenge trial courts and appellate courts across the country to start filing and raising these issues. And a lot of folks have, and I think that I hope and welcome others on this call to start doing that. And we can certainly help, get you the right cases and case law and all that stuff.
Thank you. And when you think about just some stat in certain states, it's a 50-50 chance if your child enters into the system that your rights will be terminated. 50-50. I mean,
Jay, is it's like haphazard. We terminate when kids are living with relatives. We terminate when kids are living with the other birth parent in a custody context, simply because it's convenient. And like people on this call who aren't familiar with the system may not realize that we've had cases in our clinic where we have judges saying on the record, well, since the father hasn't yet obtained custody, I guess we'll just go ahead and order the agency to file a TPR petition because it'll be administratively quicker. That is the obsession and love we have for this remedy. And we don't see the danger and the harm it's causing children every single day.
Exactly. Angelique, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in terms of remedies or recommendations, I think one other thing where, ASFA has been implemented without acknowledging or being able to challenge is, we have 3 pillars of ASFA: safety, permanence, child well-being. We haven't talked a lot about child well-being at all, but we have no federal mandates for collecting or holding states accountable to child well-being. We haven't defined it. We don't require data collected on it. And so, in a way, we've taken this ignorance is bliss mentality in terms of implementing ASFA. We don't want to know. We don't want to know the answer to that question.
It's baseless. Exactly. And Jerry, please.
Well, I just want to echo what I'm hearing everybody else saying, particularly what Angelique has just said about we don't want to know. And the simple fact is, we're getting exactly the results that our system is designed to achieve. Nothing more than that. I would say this system is not broken. It's a mismatch for what we know would be helpful and important for children, young people, and their parents. But it's operating the way we, people in power, want it to operate. Until we decide that it won't operate that way, we're going to continue to get more and more of the same outcomes, the same kinds of despicable effects that occur as a result of our work with families.
Well, thank you. Thank you all so much. I think I've learned so much just listening to each of you, and I hope everyone really hears that the system was created to destroy families out of racism, out of poverty. It's been designed to continue the death penalty for families. It's favored in that outcome as described in several different examples from you all. And it begs us to create a different world and reality for our children to remain with their families. And it's not ASFA. So I think we hit on so much, and I'm really honored to hear from all of you and all the different voices. Angelique, especially for sharing your story and being vulnerable with us today. Really appreciate that. And we are now again gifted to hear from impacted individuals, mothers, including April Lee and Dr. Reverend Michelle Simmons, who is from the group Why Not Prosper in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. These are stories from incredible mothers who all experienced termination of parental rights because of ASFA, and one that actually did have her children returned. So I share this video with everyone here and on today's webinar in brief, but the clip and the full video again will be on our website. So I hope you can all take a look for it. And thank you for spending some time with us. And thank you everyone so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Today was truly an amazing day to be able to host the Healing Mothers Circle and to be able to watch these women come into Why Not Prosper and to, work through reunification issues and to embark on a journey to regain custody of their children.
So today we heard from 4 mothers. And within that, you've seen the generational issues of being dragged into child welfare as a child. You've seen the systems not taking accountability for the harm that they caused. We see things at the end. I feel like in my case, it was more like, how dare you lose your mind after such a trauma, right? Like how dare you become an unfit parent, or you can't, you can't parent your children due to that trauma. Not understanding it was the entirety of my existence. It was the entirety of my identity. And once I lost them, I lost my identity. And I was that parent that people would say that didn't comply. I didn't comply, I didn't meet objectives, I jumped off the ledge.
I got sentenced to 23 months at PIC, and I had the first DHS, they was bringing my son up to see me on visitations. They was bringing them once a month to see me while I was incarcerated. And they was looking for somebody in my family to try to get him, kinship care. His dad couldn't get him because he was an older guy. My sister couldn't get him because her husband had a background of abuse. My mom was an older lady. His dad was older. So I didn't have nobody to take him. I didn't have no kind of resources or nothing in jail. So I just sat in jail for those 23 months, stressed and worried about whereabouts of my son. I didn't find my son after my release. I still ain't know where my son was at. I went down to DHS. They told me my son had been adopted. I never received no papers, no nothing in jail telling me that they adopted my son. And the reason why they said they adopted him, because the people said that they didn't have no contact with me, and it was past my 15 to 23 months. I had to get myself together in order for him not to be adopted, so they just went on and adopted him. And it took me years to find my son.
I feel like the timelines that the federal government give our ladies to complete the goals, right, on their service plans or what have you, is not enough time that they need to heal. After about 15 months, the fog is just lifting, right? They're beginning to realize what's going on as it relates to the parental rights. And none of them don't have a clue that this could even happen. Like, they could take my children or they could terminate my rights. This is like brand new information to them.
No, I do not think the court system supports people who struggle with drug use. I think they expect that they're going to stop addiction by giving them a time limit. And it doesn't work like that. You have to go to the root cause. You have to find out why that person is using and then help them through that so that they can want to get recovery, they can go to rehab, and they can build themselves back up and get their families back. Not just give them a time limit and say, well, if you don't get clean, then we're taking your kids and you can never see them again. How?
My son was 5 when I got incarcerated. He was 11 to 12 when I found him. I got him back in my life.
While you was incarcerated, did anybody tell you your rights?
No. I kept putting a request to staff, to my counselor, to ask her to make phone calls, to see who I could talk to about, how I get my son back, that I didn't receive no paperwork, I didn't sign no paperwork, and nothing. They just adopted him. I don't talk about it. I keep stuff to myself. And this is like the first time I talked about him. For years. But I'm just grateful I have him in my life.
A child needs their parents, period. So just because, once again, you're struggling in this area of addiction, that don't mean you don't have the capacity to be a good person. It don't mean you don't have the capacity to be a good parent. The solution to a family not having a home is not foster care. The solution to someone hitting hard times is not foster care. It's frustrating sometimes because we constantly have to humanize ourselves. We constantly got to say, hey, I am a person. I am a mother. I am a sister. I am a community member. I am an auntie. These are my children. I birthed them. Why should anyone have to prove that they love the child that they birthed?
If I could tell child welfare one thing, I would tell them to give parents a chance. Not a time limit, but a chance. Give them support. Find out what's going on. Dig a little deeper and actually help them. Don't take their kids away. That's not helping. That's only making things worse.
Well, I want to acknowledge the women of the Healing Circle and April Lee and all of the parents that shared parts of their soul, their trauma, and their love with us. I'm reminded that healing circles are only needed when harm has actually occurred. And what we heard from our mothers was how the act of separating them from their children has profoundly changed them and altered their life. My name is Shrounda Selivanoff, and I am also an impacted parent through the child welfare system, kinship caregiver to my most wonderful grandson, and the Director of Public Policy over at Children's Home Society of Washington. And wanted to just take an opportunity to talk a little bit about the importance of having those most impacted in hearing from them to understand the harms of ASFA. So I just want to start off by just saying that the act of harm, ASFA, is a traumatic and it's a harmful act. The US has a very long, egregious, and disheartening history of separating families. And the Adoption Safe Family Act has positioned us in a way that allows for those to be separated with their families under the premise that there is someone else safer and that these children are better off. I'd like to point out that 1 in 4 children that are adopted actually commit suicide. And that what is evident by that type of outcome is that there's a profound sadness not being with those that you love and treasure the most. ASFA, for me, is a place where we have to really grapple with, once again, our history. And thinking that there is someone better. I'm always confronted with the notion and with the facts that we provide resources and that we celebrate dismantling families. And that we sentence a person to a state of suffering. I'm always at the conflictual place to be to celebrate off of someone's suffering. And that we have dehumanized our women, our fathers, as if they are deserving and unworthy of their child's love. Also, that our children are undeserving and don't desire their mama's love. And that they will continuously search a lifetime wanting to have that very biological, emotional, and physical connection. As I turn this over to Shireen, I want to just bring you back to it just a moment. And I want you to think about a mama's hug or a mama's smile and that dad's high five. And while we certainly can acquire some of those hugs and high fives along the way, because we have lots of opportunities for connection, there is something absolutely unexplainable of a mama's hug or a dad's embrace. It cannot be replicated. It cannot be duplicated. And so as we go into this conversation talking about Adoption Family Safe Act, I want to just bring us back to there's nothing more safe than a mama's hug and a dad's embrace. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Shireen, as we talk more about the harms of this act of separating our families.
Thank you, Shrounda, and thank you for that feeling and some hope that you left with us just now. And I also want to thank everyone who planned and participated in this really important event. My name is Shireen White. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Policy at Children's Rights, which is a national nonprofit that uses strategic advocacy and impact litigation to make systemic changes in America's child welfare, youth justice, immigration, education, and healthcare systems. November 19th marks 25 years since the Adoption and Safe Families Act, or ASFA, was enacted. And there's really no way to change our current circumstances, to change these stories of harm and hurt and family separation, than to undo and dismantle the laws that continue to allow this harm to occur. Children's Rights is proud to partner with lived experts, with Family Integrity and Justice Works at Public Knowledge, the Family Justice Group, the Center for the Study of Social Policy, United Family Advocates, and the National Association of Counsel for Children to bring you additional conversations and a campaign focused on the harm and impact that ASFA has had on children and families. And there's no one who can talk about that and provide us strategies that will move us forward than lived experts themselves. We hope that you will join us in the future aspects of this campaign, including for a webinar that is tentatively scheduled for November 15th from 1 to 2 o'clock Eastern. And it will focus on the experiences and voices of lived experts whose parents had their rights terminated. And I'm now going to turn it over to Kathleen Creamer, who is the managing attorney of the Family Law Unit at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia.
Hi. My name is Kathleen Creamer, and I'm the managing attorney of the Family Advocacy Unit at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia. I first want to thank Shrounda and Shireen for their presentation today on the importance of impacted voice. I'm excited to talk about a path forward. We must fundamentally rethink our child welfare laws and the assumptions upon which they're built. Children have a right to lifelong connection to their families and communities. Yet we've created a system that is designed to take away what's most precious to children and parents. Where radical harm exists, radical change is necessary. And I join the growing calls to imagine a radically different way of caring for children and families. In the meantime, we must act with urgency to end the harm of the Adoption and Safe Families Act. And I want to suggest to you some statutory changes that could help us get there. At minimum, the statute should be immediately amended to, first of all, raise the standard for family separation. We must require agencies to show an imminent risk of serious harm to separate a family. The Adoption and Safe Families Act invites agencies to separate families anytime they can show that it's contrary to the welfare of the child to be in their home. That is a low standard that has invited way too many families to experience the harm of family separation. We also have to look at the efforts that we're making to prevent family separation and to reunify families. Families need to be offered concrete, active help. And I would suggest that we replace reasonable efforts with active efforts. We have to try more than reasonably to avoid the life-altering harm of family separation. I also think we need to eliminate cookie-cutter timelines. The 15-month timeline in the Adoption and Safe Families Act is not tailored to the individual needs of any child or any family. Children deserve individualized plans that meet their own needs and look at their own family's circumstances. Really, truly crucially, we have to eliminate the presumption for adoption. We need to presume that children will have a lifelong relationship with their own family and their own culture. We have to prioritize guardianship over adoption when families cannot reunify. I would also suggest that we raise the bar to terminate parental rights. It is too easy to permanently end families right now. We must require an agency to first show that lifelong family connections are harmful to children as a prerequisite to adoption. We know that children need lifelong connections to their own families, and having such an easy process for termination of parental rights means that so many children are losing their families forever when they could be kept together. And finally, we must look at aggravated circumstances. We need to prohibit agencies from using normal family struggles like parental disability or parental incarceration to fast track children to lose their families forever. Those are some of my suggestions for immediate legislative change for the Adoption and Safe Families Act. I would want to call our listeners' attention to the 21st Century Children and Families Act, which is HR 5856. This is legislation that is currently pending in Congress that doesn't do everything that I suggested, but does an awful lot to protect children and their rights to their own families. I'm going to go over a couple of the features of that act and why I think it could be so helpful to children and families if we could pass this legislation. First of all, the 21st Century Act exempts children in care of a relative from the termination of parental rights timeline, and it extends the timeline to 24 months rather than 15 months, giving more families the opportunity to do what they need to do to get the support that they need to get to reunify their families. This act also exempts parents from the timeline when the parent is actively engaged in services. So we won't have those cases where parents are being cut off and pushed into termination of parental rights just because the time clock has run out, even though they're doing everything they could possibly be doing to support their path to reunification. We would also see in the 21st Century Act modification of parental rights being prohibited when the basis is solely parental incarceration or detention of the parent by the Department of Homeland Security. Really crucially, the 21st Century Act would require states to demonstrate that they provided the family the services, support, and time that they needed to address the reason for the child's placement in foster care, and requires that the agency show that termination of parental rights would be in the child's best interest before they can even proceed on a petition. The 21st Century Act also asks states to report on disproportionality and disparities in access to services in their child welfare system. While the 21st Century Act is not a solution to all of the problems in the Adoption and Safe Families Act, it is a really pivotal instrument to help alleviate so much of the harm that families are experiencing right now. And I would ask our listeners to take a good look at it. I want to turn it over at this point to David Kelly and Victor Sims, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kathleen, for charting the course. What we've heard today should shock our collective conscience, but we've known it for years, and we've allowed it to continue happening. We've looked the other way. The pain that April and Alexandra expressed is real, and it's experienced by tens of thousands of parents across the country every day. It's suffering that can and should be avoided. Right now, children are being taken from their parents without efforts to keep them together. And it causes trauma that can last a lifetime. Once a child is taken, there's less than a 50% chance they'll ever go home. For a kid who spends time in foster care, the future is often bleak. ASFA and the mindset it represents, the mindset it reflects, is the driving force. It sustains an industry of separation. There's no time for mincing words. ASFA is bad law and it must be repealed. It's unjust, it's unfair, and it's hurting families. ASFA is inherently anti-family. It flies in the face of what we know about substance misuse and recovery. It's counter to what we know about relational health, healing, well-being, and belonging. And it confuses hardship with harm. As people who care about other people, it's time to act. Whether you're motivated by justice, faith, economics, or common decency, repeal is the clearest path. As Kathleen has highlighted, the 21st Century Act offers a solid alternative, a step in the right direction. It doesn't go far enough, but it will stop some of the most egregious harm. We urge you to contact your elected officials on the Hill and express the urgent need for change. I'd now like to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, Victor Sims, to share the urgency further. Victor?
Yes, thank you, David. I think about everything that all of the other people have said before us today. And one thing is clear, that ASFA in its current state is harming families. It's separating them for a mistake that may have happened once. We are better than this. America is built off of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And some people don't even have a chance because of the color of their skin, as we think about our Black and brown families who have been most impacted by ASFA. We dig a little longer and we think about incarceration rates and how a year in some of those sentences just isn't long enough when it comes to our families impacted by the foster care system. We have to forego what it means for reasonable efforts when we're looking at the workforce crisis as it is today, the impacts that just child welfare has when it comes to permanency as workers and as an industry, when workers quit and how it affects the likelihood of reunification or permanency. One thing that is actually permanency, and something that I've always believed, is regardless of whether a child's adopted or permanent guardianship, their blood, where they come from, that's permanent. Something that every child, every person gets to inherit, regardless of income, regardless of class status, is the family that they belong to. That's why ASFA is important, because families are sacred. Knowing who you are is sacred, and belonging is sacred. So I echo the words of David Kelly. Reach out to your congresspeople on the Hill. Push for the 21st Century Act. Let's make ASFA, let's repeal it, because in its current state, it's harming families. Thank you. In the next 2 weeks, you're going to hear from our partners with the children's rights. Please tune in. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Victor. And also my sincere thanks to every speaker and panelist that we had today, especially to the parents who shared their stories and their hearts and their families with us. I genuinely hope that their stories will stay with you. I hope that they stay with you as you contemplate how you would want your family, your children, or your relatives supported if they found themselves needing that help. I know that it will stay with me as I come home to my own children tonight. Throughout our time together today, I've heard many words. Here are a few that I captured: pain, destruction, suffering, trauma, separation, cruel, unfair, racist, and bleak. The costs and injustices that are experienced by our families are tangible in ways that most people will never know. Our families need something very different than what they are getting now. And in order to create this, it will require those of us in power to shift our thinking, our doing, and our speaking. And no doubt, it will be hard and uncomfortable. But what else could be more worthy of our time and focus? Let our collective actions from today forward change the words that are used to describe the system to some of the following: kind, fair, loving, caring, helpful, sustaining, and generous. If we can succeed, even a little, it will begin to show the whole world what family really is: sacred, secure, and unconditional. Thank you.